bevo.com.
Greg Dyke holds several senior positions here in the UK. He's chairman of the British Film Institute. He is also author of Greg Dyke Inside Story. He was previously the Director General of the BBC. Greg, welcome to Bevo.
Thank you.
Greg, you're known for having a massive fighting spirit and huge determination, and once you actually said, I'll never be a lame duck at anything. So where does that fighting spirit come from?
I think I was the third of three sons, and one was a better footballer than me, and one was a better painter and was cleverer than me, but I was the most determined. And I was always determined and always have been. I mean, there are some disadvantages of it, of course, because as I get old, I look at my life and think, you didn't have to take on every fight. You know, there were some that you could have ducked. And that's my advice to anybody, is only take on the ones that matter. Don't take them all on.
Choose your fights.
Well, choose your fights so that the ones that matter, although you can't always tell the ones that matter.
But overall, there's more pros than cons to being as determined as you are?
No, the world is full of clever people. I mean, there's nothing like going to the BBC to see a world full of clever people. But some of them lack that sort of determination. Now, that's of course assuming that what you want out of life is that, as opposed to just living there. Some people are quite happy living there. But I mean, I don't think being, I think one of the cons of the British education system is that it cons people into being clever is enough, and it's not. You've got to have energy and determination and ideas, which don't necessarily come along with being seen as clever when you're at school or university.
Yeah, because one of the most successful people I know in the US has said that, people make the mistake of just trying to do their best, whereas in actual fact, that's probably not good enough, is it? I think it's more of a matter of just doing whatever it takes.
Well, I think doing your best, everybody does their best. I mean, a lot of the time, don't they? I mean, people do their best. I don't think that matters, really. I think it's about, my conclusion about most jobs is about ideas, really. The people with ideas are worth their weight in gold. I mean, there are some people who've got ideas who can't do anything else, and that's difficult. But the people with ideas are worth their weight in gold.
You mentioned in your book that one of the toughest times during your time at the BBC, you picked up the phone and you called Sir Christopher Bland, which is one of your mentors at the time. Can you tell me who the other mentor was that you had, and what is it about those two that you admired so much?
My other mentor was Melvyn Bragg. And both I'd worked with for many years, both had become friends. Christopher, he'd been the chairman and I'd been the chief executive in a couple of places now. Melvyn was a much better politician than me, much better, a very talented man, knows about everything. I mean, unnerves me because he knows too much. I would get really excited because I discovered something and I'd tell him, you've had that, he knew all that. And a lot more. But they're just good friends, and they've always been, in the end you've got to trust people. Christopher, I've always had a lot of time for, because Christopher was my chairman when I was chief executive of London Weekend. And when the going gets rough in organisations, who's still there is the interesting thing. Who's disappeared and who's still there. Christopher was always there.
When you left the BBC, a lot of people went out in the street and marched in support of you. And I think, in actual fact, it was Herb Schlosser, former CEO and president of NBC in the US, said, I saw on the internet BBC employees marching in support of a CEO. This is the first in the history of the Western world. So a lot of CEOs will probably be thinking, if I left an organisation, would people go out on the streets and march in support of me? And I probably think a few of them will be thinking, well, only if it was a sort of nice dry heat at 27 degrees. But people followed you out into the street in January of 2004. So how were you able to create such willing followers? I know you write about it in your book, but in a nutshell, how were you able to do that?
Well, first of all, if people are going to walk out, there's no way better to do it at the television station because it gets on the news. And, some people came out at what happened is some people came out at Television Centre. That got on the news, and then all over the country they came out. I always loved the local radio station in Shrewsbury. Everybody walked out, and they carried on broadcasting from the street, and all those sort of things happened. Why? Because we'd spent 4 years telling them that we valued what they did. By and large, people want to be valued. And we had, when I arrived at the BBC, it was a pretty unhappy place. They didn't like my predecessor. I mean, and they blamed him for everything, often nothing to do with him at all, but he got the blame for everything that was wrong, but they didn't like him. I have taken the view over many years that the job of the CEO is to spend a lot of time communicating with the people who work there. So I spend a lot of time on the road, I spend a lot of time talking to people. We use all sorts of tricks to communicate, but we also opened it up for them. You know, my belief was people will always perform better if they work in an environment where they're valued rather than in an environment where they're afraid. So how do you create that? Well, you've got to give them, therefore, the ability to get on with things. And that means sometimes they'll make mistakes. That's part of life. But if you just, if everything is going to be checked and double checked and everything's got to go through this hierarchical structure, and you don't get anything done. So my view has always been free people up, let them enjoy themselves, have a good time, let them think that you value them, because then they'll accept the tough times. Then they'll accept when you say, look, this is very tough and we're going to have to get rid of people, this is what's going to happen. They'll live with all that. But they've got to believe you. They've got to believe you.
Lots of CEOs and hiring managers are told to hire creative types of people to sort of challenge assumptions and to come up with new ideas constantly. But I think a lot of hiring managers are afraid of doing that because of the possible chaos that could come about from hiring all those creative types. But you've worked in television, obviously, so you've hired both creative people, but you've also been able to get incredible results through perhaps creating organised chaos. So can you tell us about how you've actually been able to achieve that?
Change is non-stop. You can't. There's no such thing as an organisation where, people who work in organisations would love it to stop. But of course it can't stop, because there's always someone coming around the outside who's going to do it better and faster and quicker than you are if you're not on your toes. So you've got to be constantly up for change. Then you've got to say, well, who are the change agents? And what we tried to do was make the change agents people throughout the company, the younger people and the rest, who would challenge. I remember one day standing up and said, BBC, and saying, look, I give you my word that if you try something and it goes wrong and you've done it in the best interests of what you thought were the best interests of the organisation, we'll support you. Because I want you to try some things and do some things, as opposed to waiting for permission for everything. Now, at times that can be difficult, but I think in the end you get a different sort of workforce.
Greg, you're known for your great communication skills throughout an organisation. So I know that back at the BBC, for example, you did everything from sort of emailing all staff through to going down to the canteen and chatting reasonably informally with the people around you. Could you give us a sort of A to Z of how to communicate magically throughout an organisation?
First of all, I've always been much better at communicating downwards than I am upwards, right? So I should have learned some of the other. I might have survived longer in places. In a big organisation, how do you make people feel that you, as the management team, care about them, that you know what they're doing, that you value what they're doing? And that is about informing them and helping them and teaching them. And we did loads of emails to everybody. But you can't just, you've got to be careful. If you just do emails that they're the latest dirge come from the management, everybody goes to sleep. Oh, God. So they came from me. Only I could write them. No one else was allowed to write them. Could never be more than a page. They were just signed Greg. And they're always about trying to tell you something that mattered, something that was important. So sometimes you go weeks without sending one. And other times you go 2 in a week, but they've got to tell you something. They've got to be something that you'd be into. I mean, I had the advantage of having been trained as a journalist, so that you instinctively know, A, how to write in a way that people notice, and 2, what does matter and what doesn't matter to the people out there. And that's what we did. We just communicated with them, we just wrote them. Then we used, actually one time we used to make videos. So I don't think people give enough time. In communications departments in companies, they spend all their time trying to communicate with the outside world and not enough time trying to communicate inside. And I think they've got it the wrong way around. The outside bit is often sexier. So it appeals more to the press office and people like that. But actually, you've got to communicate inside. You've got to work out how do you do that, how do you do it effectively. The worst, particularly if you're in the media, which is a very high-profile industry, because the last thing you want to do is read it in the paper before you know it. So you want to tell them. If something big's happening, tell them on the day. Make sure there's an email going out to everybody. Make sure everybody knows before the media knows.
And is there any unintended consequences of communicating first internally?
Well, of course, you always take the disadvantage of that. The disadvantage is if you communicate something that is a good story, there's always someone in there that will put it out there and flog it. But I mean, it's an interesting thing. Someone was telling me they met Fabio Capello the other day, and they said the most interesting thing about Capello said was the hardest job he's had to do is to stop his players reading and believing the sports press. And I think that applies to organisations like the BBC that are constantly in the spotlight. That actually, what you will tell you the truth. You don't have to believe all that stuff. I mean, I remember being on the board of Manchester United at one time, and everybody on the board of Manchester United used to come in and say, "God, have you seen what's happening at Leeds?" And you'd say, "But it's not true, is it? You know what they write about Manchester United isn't true. So why do you believe what they write about Leeds?" Because I'm a sports journalist, it's just about the worst for being truthful and honest.
One of the things that you did so well at the BBC was you lifted not just the morale of the London central offices, but which would be relatively easy for somebody like you to do that, but you raised the morale of all of the locations of the BBC across the UK. So what advice would you give to a CEO that wants to lift the morale of all corners of a multi-sited organisation?
You've got to spend enough of your time doing communicating. Getting out there. You've got to spend, I reckon 20-25% of your time now. That's the job of a CEO. Because the days when you could just say as a CEO, you do it, and they did it. Oh, they're years gone. Nobody does that anymore. They'll say they do it, but they don't do it. So what you've got to do is you've got to communicate. You've got to get them to understand what you're all trying to do. What you're trying to do. If you can all go in the same direction, it's easy, isn't it? Yeah. People make it much more complicated than it is. But part of the reason is people there's a terrible danger that as people go up the management chain, they change. They go from being people who are everybody knows, chats to, and the rest of it, to being people who suddenly think that because they've gone up the chain, they've somehow got to be aloof. They've somehow got to be separate. And that's a killer. There's a couple of guys called Rob Goffey and Gareth Jones who wrote a book which was called Why Should Anybody Be Led by You? And it said the single most important factor in leadership is authenticity. Are you really who you are? Or are you someone that you've created? And the danger is people on going up the chain start becoming like they think managers should be, as opposed to just being them.
Like Richard Branson, you and he are both known for your being very authentic to your personality, and also, as we said earlier, you're very driven, but you also have a lot of fun in the workplace. I was once told that you were told off for making too many jokes, for example, in governor meetings.
It was suggested to me that I made too many jokes in meetings of the BBC governors. Now, the BBC governors are not people I loved by any means. I said to them, I make jokes in all meetings. That's part of the thing. I'm not going to walk into a BBC governors meeting and suddenly feel, I've got to revere these people. Most of them I couldn't stand.
So, in actual fact, you should be more yourself, if anything. Is there anything?
I think it depends how big the organisation is you're trying to run. Right? Small organisations, you can get around, you can communicate, they can all know you. The bigger and bigger it gets, that's harder and harder. Therefore, how do you communicate with them? How do they know about you? I'm a great believer in this thing about stories, right? You tell stories. All people tell stories about you. If you're the leader of an organisation, people always underestimate the things that people like about them, the things that they don't like about them, but the stories they tell. So if you walk in and you ignore the receptionist and you never say hello to the security guard and you book the lift in advance so there's nobody else that's in it, so that because you can go up on your own so you don't have to be bothered, that's the story they tell about you. And that is only negative. If you walk in and chat to everybody, say hello, meet people in the lift, talk to them, you go up to the canteen, you get your own food, you sit down with people, that's the story they tell about you. Simple as that. And what are you trying to achieve? You're trying to achieve that you're one of them. We're all on the same side. We're all trying to go in the same way.
But you're lucky because you've naturally got that gregarious personality there, haven't you?
I've learned that. My head of HR once said to me at BBC, "You're not really gregarious at all, are you?" And I said, "No, I've learned it. I've learned how to do it. If you put me in a room full of strangers, I'd rather go and stand in the corner and talk to the 2 or 3 people I know. But you have to, if you want to lead an organisation, you can't do that. You've got to learn to go and talk." So I've learned over the years how to go and talk.
I think you've learned very well, sir.
But communicating to you is different. The media is another concept altogether. How to communicate with the media is a different thing, but how to communicate with the people who work for you, how to talk to them, find out what's the problem. I mean, one of the things I did when I first went to the BBC, which is why they liked me, is I wandered around the place and I said only 2 questions. What can I do? What can we do together to improve our service to the public? And what can I do to make your life better? You see, because I think those 2 are absolutely intrinsically linked. If the staff feel good about the job, what they're doing, about the organisation, they'll do a better job.
When you first became chief executive, I understand that you read a lot about John Kotter, and some of his principles helped guide you through your first few years as chief executive. So what were some of those sort of gems of John Kotter that helped you so much in your first few years?
I went to Harvard, to the business school, to do one of these 12-week courses. Just after had been appointed as chief executive of London Weekend. I was just about to take up the job. So off I go to Harvard thinking, this is going to be boring, it's going to be a bunch of Americans telling us how wonderful they are and the rest of it. And actually what I did was quite the opposite. I came across John Kotter, who gave us 2 or 3 lectures a week for 10 weeks, 12 weeks. And basically what I learned from that, what he basically said was the best companies and the best organisations in the world are the one where they all know where they're going, they all join together. But what it gave, the whole Kotter experience for me was it gave me the confidence to just going on being me. I mean, he was the first person I'd ever met intellectually who sat and explained what he thought the difference was between management and leadership. And for me, what it did for me was it gave me the confidence to carry on doing the things that I think I did naturally. But now I believe there was an intellectual base for them as opposed to, it's just how I think. I mean, my view is simple. You should treat people properly. If you treat people properly, if you listen to them, that doesn't say you're soft, but if you treat people properly, they'll be fine.
I agree, because sometimes the more senior people get, the more they think they've got to be sort of, they've got to shout more, they've got to become more dominant, and they just have a sort of personality transformation.
You can understand it. Often they're a bit unnerved by getting the job, and they think that's how it was treated to them. That's how they were treated, and therefore they think they've got to treat other people like that.
I know you say that you're not gregarious, but you certainly, when you walk into a room, people know that you're there. You've got great charisma. How have you created that?
I got a lovely letter when I got some good ones when I left the BBC. I mean, one of them, my favourite email was the one that just said, "Of Dyke, I never liked you anyway." But I mean, but I got another one from somebody, and it just said, "How did a short, bald bloke with a speech impediment have this impact?"
Really? Did you fight with these names?
No. Listen. People. No, she was lovely. I know the person who wrote it. It was a very nice thing. But that's what she wanted to know. How do you have that impact? It's a mixture, isn't it? If you're the chief executive or the boss of an organisation, you start with a massive advantage because everybody wants to know you anyway. Then it's a bit about how you communicate. It's a bit about how you talk to everybody. Do you care about the things that they care about? I mean, my theory of media companies, for instance, is if they think which are going through a rough time, most of them, if they think all you're interested in is money, you're dead. Right? I mean, different than the BBC, but I mean, in the commercial world, if they think all you're interested in is money, you've had it. Because they're not. They're interested in it because they're passionate about it and they believe in it. You don't come here and interview me just because they pay you. You come here because you're interested in it. And you want the person who you work for to be interested in your interview, as opposed to be interested in how much money you're going to be made out of it. So my theory on media companies is straightforward. And I think Murdoch has always understood this. That's why I think he's been so incredibly successful. Is people have to, the whole way you approach them is about what they're doing and the work that's being done. So when I went to the BBC, I came up with this line that I picked from Clinton, really. But, Clinton's line, it's the economy, stupid, why he won. My line is in the media company, in television, on radio, it's the programme, stupid. That's all it is. That's all they are. It's a collection of programmes. Everything else is secondary to that. Now, if the staff, if they think so when we started making cuts at the BBC, cutting the overhead, I was able to say, look, this is easy, really. We're not giving this to shareholders. This is something to spend more money on the programmes, because that's what we're here for. We're not here to have this myriad of middle management, this whole bureaucracy. We're here to make and broadcast programmes.
Yeah, because if you're just chasing the money, it's like a dog chasing its tail. It just goes round and round in circles.
Well, they don't like you if you just say you're chasing the money. They don't like you. It's much. At a place like the BBC, it's so much easier to go out and say we're trying to save money so we can spend more on programmes, than to walk around most commercial organisations saying we're getting rid of you and we want to save more money because we want to give more to our shareholders. That doesn't necessarily go down well. So in some ways, it was an easy message at a place like the BBC.
You're the epitome of an inspirational leader. So do you think that all organisations need an inspirational leader at the top, or do you think they can get away with having one that's sort of very business process, logical, accountant style person at the top of their company?
I think if you can infuse the people who work for you and they make them feel valued, it's an enormous asset in making organisations work. However, if you've got entirely the wrong strategy, it makes no difference at all, because you're buggered anyway. So you've got to have a strategy, but then you've got to sell it, and then you've got to get people on side for it. And all the work you do with your staff is about making sure they give you the benefit of the doubt. He's all right, so I don't think, he's all right. I don't like that idea, but he's all right, so we'll follow. That's what you're looking for.
You've been able to always hire the best people around you, to come and work for you, even in relatively low budget environments. What advice would you give to, hiring managers that are trying to hire the best talent in the marketplace today, but with relatively low budgets because of the economy?
Well, it depends on what you talk about grade A talent. There's different sorts of talent. There's the on-screen talent, who have to be dealt with in a different way. On-screen talent are artists, and they always profess not that money doesn't matter, but I don't believe it. But what they see the money as is a means of value. People. It is remarkable how many people you can get on side just by saying, "Thank you, it was a good job, well done." Like that film, that was a good piece. Or sending him a note. I think the other thing is, it's interesting, isn't it, in your life, you discover things. I discovered when I first had kids that these were the best days of your life. That having I've always believed that there are days of your life. Now, one of those days is the day your kids are born, or however many kids you got. Yeah. So one way of getting people, one of the things we did when I was running London Weekend is we just sent everybody who had a baby a bunch of flowers on behalf of the company. Just said thank you. And every Christmas we held an enormous kids' Christmas party. And it cost us about 50 grand. And everybody said, a waste of money. You say, it's nothing. It's nothing compared to the goodwill it buys you. Because what you're saying to not only to the people who work for you, but their spouses, their children, because we used to have grandchildren coming along and the rest of it, is thanks. Thanks.
At the board level, how important is the chairman-chief executive relationship?
I think the most important relationship in most organisations at the senior level is between the chief executive and the chairman. If they can stay together, if they can understand each other, if they can always explain what's going on and the rest of it, then I think by and large you've got the basis for a decent company. What happened to me at the BBC was my chairman resigned. I thought unnecessarily, he thought it was necessary to. But at that moment I had a board that was in disarray. It had no chairman, no leaders. So the ones the people who became the leaders tended to be the people who didn't want me.
Interesting. So do you think if the chairman didn't resign and there wasn't an acting chairman position, then...
If they'd waited 2 more days, I wouldn't be there by now, I'd have left by now, but if they waited 2 more days, would have been no problem. But they didn't, they panicked. But also, you know, there's some people on that board who didn't like me and were quite pleased to get rid of me. They thought I was an oik, bit of an upstart. Didn't come from the same background as them.
That's interesting. Do you think that the UK, though, is getting better at judging people more on sort of meritocracy and performance as opposed to where they're from, where they were educated and what their background is?
I think the UK has changed massively in my lifetime, but never underestimate the British. Remember, the board of governors of the BBC aren't people who are commercially successful. They're the British great and the good. And the British great and the good want people to be subservient and always have done. And the fact that they're laughed at now doesn't matter. You know, there are very few places where you find those people. I mean, it's not all of them. There were some governors who I loved when I was at the BBC. Sadly, by the time I'd gone, most of them had gone before me. But I mean, the Richard Ayres of this world, you know, who used to run the National Theatre, was a wonderful governor. He was, you know, because what you look for, what you really want from a board is advice, isn't it? You want, when I was running London Weekend, I was comparatively young. I had both Christopher Bland as chairman, but I had a guy called Roger Harrison, who was the senior non-exec, who was just a wise old bird. And he was worth listening to, because actually he saw you through things that were quite difficult. And that's what you want. You want that sort of help and support.
One of the things you're known for is always being able to attract great talent to the Greg Dyke team. So is that one of the reasons why you've been so successful?
Oh, always. Always. When I joined Pearson a few years back, I said, look, and we were setting up Pearson TV, which is now Fremantle, a very big, successful international media company. I told Pearson, I said, well, it's not just me, there's me and someone else comes. And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, there's this other bloke who comes with me. And they said, well, what does he do? I said, well, he does the thinking. I said, well, what do you do? I said, I do the PR. And he said, well, why don't we just employ him? I said, doesn't work without the PR. But what you need around you is people you trust and people who complement you. I mean, I'm a big picture, big ideas, crap on detail. So what you want is, what I want around me is people who pick it up. And then, secondly, you want people who are prepared to challenge you, who say, that's completely wrong. And that was one of the things, one of the problems I had when I first went to the BBC. I mean, the BBC had been so scared of the Director General before me that, you know, almost anything you said, they did. And you say, well, I didn't want you to do it, I want you to discuss it. It might not be right, I don't know. There's no font of wisdom, you know, let's just throw it around and see what we discuss. The third thing is you want people who, I mean, I look back at the best people who worked for me over the years are the ones who, when you sit there and have a problem, they go away and they come in the next day and they say, I've got a solution to that. Hear about this for an idea. Why don't we do it like that? They're the people you want. But you can only get that if you let them get on with it. So I've never wanted to do the detail. I've never wanted to go and do all that stuff, you know. So if you work for me, if we're having a good idea, yeah, okay, right, you go do it. But I do that with all my life. I mean, you know, with my family, you know. My accountant rang me up the other day and he said, you know, you said the other day, we sat down and he said, you do that. And I said to him, you do this and I'll do the rest. He said, yeah. I said, well, I've been through it all. There is no rest. He said, you gave it all to me. I said, that's life. That's life. I mean, you know, so I've always wanted, not that I want them to, but you've got to let people just get on with it. It's the last thing they want. What drives them nuts is constantly you changing your mind, you're doing this, you're doing that. In the end, make a decision. Make a decision. Could be the right one or the wrong one, but make a decision. And don't keep analysing it to death, because actually the one thing that kills good ideas in the end is boredom.
It's interesting you say that. So delegation is one of the, apart from hiring great talent and your natural charisma, I know you don't.
Well, you get good talent. You get good talent if you let them get on with it.
Yeah.
But there's a bunch of people who worked with me over many years in different places, and there's others you pick up. I mean, it was interesting, my time at the BBC, what I was interested in the BBC was what I thought were the innovative things we did came from people outside of the BBC culture. Not all, no, it's about unkind, not all, but most of the things came, there was a team of people who hadn't come from within the BBC. Which again was one of the lessons which was taught to me at Harvard all those years ago. It's much harder for people from within the culture to change the organisation.
Well, on the premise that you just don't know what you don't know?
It's a disadvantage going in, of course. I mean, one of the reasons my time at the BBC was limited, I think, was because I never understood the politics of it. I didn't even bother to understand the politics of it. Mate, you could get on and do things. But in the end, it catches up with you if you're not careful. The people who've been in an organisation all that stuff, they know the politics. They've lived with it. You haven't if you come from outside.
One of the things that you say in your book that's particularly pertinent to me is the fact that your desk was usually quite messy, and that you were quite jealous, or you held in high regard Mark Byford's desk, because his was sort of well processed and sort of structured and clean. But can you tell me, but you didn't try and change it, and you sort of focused on yourself, just being Greg Dyke, and sort of, you focused on your strengths, not your weaknesses. Is that something that you think people should always do?
I used to be next to my mate Nick Evans when we ran a programme years earlier. He went on to write The Horse Whisperer and the rest of it. Nick and I, his desk was immaculate. Mine was a disaster. So whenever he used to go home, I used to go and work at his desk because it was nice and clean. I'd love to have had a desk like that, but it was never going to happen. And it still isn't. If you go into, I go into my office now. I work from home most of the time, and I go into that office, and it's just, my partner won't go in. She just keeps the door shut because it's just strewn with paper. I know the system, but no, I'd love to have a clear desk. But
then you also say you need to have people that complement you as well.
I mean, you have to have good finance people, you have to have good operations, you've got to have people who can do, but also, as I say, don't underestimate, you've got to have people who are prepared to say, that's wrong.
You say in your book that one of the benefits of working in a large organisation, a sort of commercial one, is that you've got the P&L transparency. You can see how well the CEO is doing and the individual business performance by looking at how much money they're making. But in a public sector organisation, you don't have that profit and loss transparency. So what measures should a CEO be looking at every day as a sort of a metric to see how well they're doing?
I mean, one of the simple things I did when I got to the BBC was said, OK, what percentage of our income gets spent on the overhead? And the answer, I think, was 24%. So a quarter of all the money was going on, you can argue about how you measure the overhead, but as long as you keep it consistent. But going on the overhead was going on running the organisation. And I just said, OK, so let's halve this. And I think by the time I left, we got it to 14%. And it was probably still a bit high. But don't, now that's easy. People want things they can measure on everywhere, don't they? I mean, I remember David Cameron saying to me that, who was in the television business when he was with Carlton, saying that people in politics pretend not to read the polls, but it's completely untrue, because that's one of the few measurements they've got, how they're doing. He said in much the same way as in television, always pretend not to read the ratings, but of course the ratings matter because it tells you how you're doing.
So talking about decision making, how does Greg Dyke make decisions? Is it intuition? Is it gut feeling? Is it weighing it up on a spreadsheet, the pros and cons? How do you do that? My head of strategy at the BBC, who now works for ITV, wrote a thing about me and said the thing about Greg is that if you get to 75%, he goes. And actually, I'm the Chancellor of the university up at York, which has been incredibly successful. If you look at what they've done up there, it's the same sort of idea. They had a Vice-Chancellor who, if you got to 70%, go and take the risk on the rest. And I think that's part of it. You've got to, if you want certainty, you're never going to do anything. And you can analyse more, and that's where I think a lot of very clever people run into problems. You can keep analysing, you can keep just take. What does your instinct tell you? What does your instinct tell you? I mean, when I was with Pearson Television, we bought about 6 companies in about 2 years. 1 or 2 were incredibly successful by luck, and 1 or 2 were disasters by the same sort of luck. All you've got to try to do is that you get the upside better than the downside. And if you do something big and it fails, then you go. That's all right. It's part of life. You're a visionary and a risk taker. So tell me about the vision for Greg Dyke. What's next for you?
Well, who knows? I had the opportunity to be the Conservative candidate for the Mayor of London, but I wasn't a Conservative, so it seemed to me a bit odd, and my kids would have killed me. I don't know, really. I'm 61. It's interesting how you discover other things in your life when you don't work as hard. Your family and all the rest of it, but also I've bought some land and I chopped things down and changed things. It's quite good fun and the rest of it. So it's things that I've never done in my life that you missed out on. I mean, it was funny. We were looking at all the videos of my kids when they were small the other day, and Sue, my partner, said, these are unfair. So I said, well, she said, well, it looks like you were there. And you were only there when the video camera came out, which was because there was some truth in that. And that, a lot of people who have very big business jobs trade off, really. And later in life, you try and recover some of that. If someone came along to me and said, here is a really interesting job, but bloody difficult, then I'd go and do it. But if it's not, I've never been interested in doing jobs just for the sake of them. That would be boring. And it's got to be difficult. There's no fun to be had. I always laugh about people when they take over big companies that are well run and well organised. I always say, well, where's the upside? There's no upside in that. You're going to have to go some to make that better. Whereas, take over something when it's difficult, when it's in hard times. It's good fun.
What about doing something like running the NHS? That'd be a good challenge for you, wouldn't it?
Well, the NHS has always interested me. I've always been interested in it. I don't want to run it, but I've always been interested in it because I'm interested in how do you run an organisation of 1.2 million people? How do you motivate them? How do you make them feel good? I spent a year of my life wandering around the NHS once to produce a report for the government, and which they ignored completely because it didn't agree with, again, my lack of politics meant that I just put in what I thought should be happen. It didn't fit what their view of the world was at the time. It would have fit now.
Greg, I just want to say thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure having you on Bevo.
Thank you.
Bevo